Video games are always going to have their historic and recognizable icons. You know, your Marios, your Sonics, the franchises and characters that most anybody can recognize. Even specific niches within gaming have their own established mascot franchises. Halo is always more or less going to be the face of Xbox, Street Fighter basically represents the entire fighting game genre, and the Wii will always be associated with total dog shit. These titans of video games will always have a wealth of history and impact to be discussed, but today I'm going to be talking about the games and series that history kind of shook off. Interesting and notable titles that caused ripples in their time, but as history goes on, they remain something of time capsules stuck in their era. They're recognized only by those that were around to see their impact at the time, or emerging retro enthusiasts that go beyond the various top 10s and best of lists floating around the internet. We're basically talking about the Shaggys and Nellies of video games, you know what I mean? Alex Kidd was around for a few games, now he's gone forever, okay? Sega as a whole is a pretty good starting point for a topic like this. In the late 80s, there were no video games, it was just Nintendo. Don't get me wrong, there were other offerings aside from the NES and the Game Boy, all released within the same time frame, but if we're talking only market share value, it is not even funny. Nintendo basically murdered any and all competition, and in doing so, they established their own brand name figures, many of which are still relevant today. But then, the next logical step in video games as an at-home entertainment media was released not by Nintendo, but by Sega in the form of the 16-bit Genesis, or the Mega Drive. Don't worry, Europe, I see you guys over there, I got you. Wait, hold up, y'all renamed Castlevania Bloodlines to the New Generation, and you changed the blood to water? Never mind, Europe, we are not even cool. To the earliest of hardcore gamers, the Sega Genesis was the first step towards the future of home video gaming, and in 1989 it was the only way you were going to be able to set yourself up for that future. So on that merit, the Genesis sold a cool $500,000 in its first year, and made the first real dent in Nintendo's dominance. However, this didn't change the fact that 80s America saw the NES as a fad toy, and millions of kids had it, and there were still sick-ass games coming out for it. I mean, think about it, you go to the store in 1990 and you can either pick out an NES and Super Mario Bros. 3, or a Genesis and Cyberball. Yeah, of course you're getting a Nintendo. Sega needed to bring some of its own in-house properties to the table that could match the same kind of recognition as Mario or Mega Man. Obviously, this wound up being Sonic the Hedgehog, but for a while it was up in the air as to who could be seen as the face of Sega. For a quick second, it was real-life athletes. Beginning with Tommy Lasorda Baseball at launch, Sega did this thing where they really pushed the realistic sports game capabilities of the Genesis to the adult American market. These were heavily used in the Genesis Does advertising and do a good job representing that first year after launch for the Genesis. In fact, all Sega consoles would go on to have some pretty killer sports games. Toe Jam and Earl is one of the standout non-Sonic Sega icons that comes to my mind. The first game was this awesome adventure game, today you'd call it a roguelike. Toe Jam and Earl crash land on Earth during a joyride, and they quest for their broken spaceship parts in a randomly generated world using a wide variety of items that come out of presents. This was one of the best two-player experiences of the 16-bit age. I still think it holds up. There was a sequel, Toe Jam and Earl and Panic on Funkatron. This one's radically different from the first game. The sequel is a side-scrolling platformer where Toe Jam and Earl have to capture and send back a bunch of Earthlings that caught a riot at the end of the first game. There's still an emphasis on exploration and item collecting, but the execution is worlds apart from the first game. It's fine enough on its own, and again, there's a two-player mode that really carries the whole experience, but I prefer the first one. Toe Jam and Earl would sit out the Sega Saturn, and a third game was slated for Dreamcast, but it was eventually shifted to the Xbox after the DC was dunked into being discontinued. Toe Jam and Earl 3, Mission to Earth. This one's okay too. It's like a modernized collectathon version of the first game, but it doesn't do anything spectacular, and gets repetitive by the end of it. This was the last we'd see of these characters for 17 years until the release of Toe Jam and Earl Back in the Groove in 2019. Back in the Groove is a revival effort for the series, and the first true follow-up to the very first game. I haven't gotten around to playing it myself yet, but it looks like the general critical consensus is that it's good enough if it doesn't retread too much of the same ground. As cool as it is to see these characters return after so long, I think that Toe Jam and Earl's ultimate fate is being doomed to only hold relevance in the early 1990s. I mean, look at these guys. How would you bring these two 30 years into the future? Echo the Dolphin was another one of Sega's would-be mascots. The first game was this weird, slow-burning adventure with Metroid-like exploration, magic sonar beams, and an alien abduction. I never got too into this game. It was too outside of what I perceived the Genesis to be about when I was young, that being Sonic 2, Columns, and fucking Bob. A sequel and a 4Kids version would follow, but the last we'd see of Echo would be the 2000 Dreamcast release, later ported to the PS2. A second Dreamcast title was in development, but it was axed because, of course it was, the Dreamcast was dunked on, remember? Either way, the world decided that it no longer needed Echo the Dolphin. Speaking of the Dreamcast, oh my god, Jet Set Radio. This game had so much personality, and it was one of the first premier games of its time to use cel-shaded graphics. You play as rebellious teenagers on skates, blasting funky tunes and throwing up graffiti tags. This one hasn't aged super gracefully, but it's still one of the signature Dreamcast games, and I still think it's worth checking out. Now there's a sequel on Xbox, Jet Set Radio Future, and this game is in a league all of its own. Future refines everything about the Dreamcast original. Some nuances between the two will come down to your personal preference, but this game does everything right that a sequel should. It elevates the formula into a much tighter experience that makes for one of the best action-adventure games of that generation, if you ask me. But then Sega decided to Hail Mary Jet Set Radio into oblivion, and outside of an HD re-release, there hasn't been a new game in goddamn 18 years. It's bullshit because Sega puts Jet Set Radio in their all-star games, so they clearly consider the franchise to be a significant part of their history, but they don't do anything with it, damn it! I'm sorry. Jet Set Radio Future is like one of my favorite games ever, and I just get pretty worked up about this. I wanted to highlight Sega as a whole and their own forgotten icons because I think as we enter the 2020s, Sega themselves is becoming a forgotten icon. Now I know that sounds crazy to the people that are old enough to have been entrenched in gaming's history for so long. I mean, even I'm able to remember Dreamcast kiosks at Target, but it has been about 20 years since the Dreamcast was discontinued. Sega's always gonna have their place in the history of video games. Nobody can take that away from them, but there's no refuting that their prime time has come and gone with their 3 home consoles. Sonic the Hedgehog proved that it was possible to take on Mario and Nintendo with a strong character design and a good enough game behind it. Throughout the 90s and even into the 2000s, everybody and their brother thought that they'd be able to pull this off in the same way. Awesome Possum, Bubsy, Arrow the Acrobat, Boogerman, friggin' Bonk. All these guys went for the Saturday morning cartoon recognition. Some characters stuck out more than others, like Earthworm Jim, Vectorman, or Sparkster, but they weren't going to stick around forever, as this era of game design and character design wasn't long for the world. One wannabe mascot I remember in particular from my youth was Gex. Gex was just one of the dime a dozen wannabe mascot platformer icons to emerge in the late 1990s. He was around on a few consoles, but he stuck out most on PlayStation. The first one was your very typical side-scrolling platformer, pretty good but nothing crazy. The next 2 games went 3D and took heavy cues from Super Mario 64 and the like. Gex's big gimmick is that he's jumping between worlds of the media dimension, transporting himself to different locales rooted in different genres of television, and completing different level goals. Gex has hundreds and hundreds of voice lines that'll spout off depending on the location, and I'm not kidding, this guy never shuts up. He's got one-liners for every last little occasion, but the thing is that they're all super referential to 20th century pop culture. He'll load into a level and say something like, oh, this is just like Johnny Carson's taste in women, and truthfully, a lot of that stuff goes over my head, so I can't even imagine being a kid of today and trying to play Gex. The games themselves aren't bad though. I'd say they're what you check out after you beat your Super Mario 64s and your Banjo-Kazooies. But after his third game, Gex vanished for all of time. The PlayStation was full of these, trilogies and other short series that could all be in the running for the console's mascot. Twisted Metal was synonymous with the PlayStation. These games just kept coming out for like the entire console's lifespan. Twisted Metal would have only 3 more releases over the PS2 and the PS3, and I think it's safe to say that this franchise is dead in the waters of the late 90s, unless somebody's got something big planned for the 25th anniversary this year. Parappa the Rapper was a distinguished face on PlayStation for a while. This game blew up in 1997, and a follow-up with Parappa in it called Jammerlami came out 2 years later. A proper Parappa the Rapper 2 would release on PlayStation 2, so it seemed that Sony had plans for the rapping dog, but after that, Parappa completely fell off. The character came back for an appearance in the lackluster PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale, and a remastered release commemorating the 20th anniversary of the first game came out for PS4, but other than that, it doesn't look like Sony has any plans for Parappa anytime soon. Abe from the Oddworld games gained some recognition on PlayStation as well. Oddworld Abe's Odyssey and Oddworld Abe's Exodus were 2 cinematic action puzzle platformers that filled in a niche that wasn't present on the console. You have to escape enemies, solve puzzles, and most significantly, rescue fellow members of Abe's species, the Mudokons. You as the player actually have to communicate with and escort the Mudokons to safety. In Abe's Exodus, this is fleshed out way more. You're able to communicate with multiple guys at once, Mudokons have different emotions that make them react differently. This whole game is just a massive step up from the original, which was already this kind of dark horse breakout hit. These two games gave Abe his own little slice of the PlayStation icon pie, and Exodus is seriously one of my favorite games ever. Abe would return in the Xbox sequel, Oddworld Munch's Odyssey, which features a second protagonist. As was tradition at the time, Munch's Odyssey shed Oddworld's side-scrolling origins in favor of a fully realized 3D game. The core formula of the Abe games converted over well enough, but a lot does get lost in translation. Munch's Odyssey is a fine enough game on its own merits, but if you stack it directly against the Abe games, I would not fault you for finding it a disappointment. Abe was pretty much forgotten after this point, as there were no new Oddworld games for a while, at least until 2014 when Abe returned for Oddworld Abe's Odyssey New and Tasty, a from-the-ground-up remake of the original. This was cool. It was great to see the character return after almost 15 years. And coming out, eventually, I guess, is the new Oddworld Soulstorm, a much more original reimagining of Abe's Exodus that's looking to get pretty liberal with its changes from the PS1 release. Well, shoot, given that there's a new game coming out, you can't really call Abe a forgotten icon, huh? I mean, his PS1 heyday is long gone, and he's still got a niche following today. That's the thing with being forgotten. It only exists in past tense. Only after 20 years do you realize, oh man, they don't make Cool Borders games anymore. Fable looks like it'll wind up being in forgotten territory one day. This series was totally an Xbox icon. The first one was the big Western RPG on the original console at the time, and I think Fable 2 is one of the best games on Xbox 360. Fable 3 kinda shits the bed after that, but I guess it's alright on its own. A family-friendly beat-em-up and a Connect rail shooter were released after that, so it really seemed like Microsoft was rolling with Fable as one of their flagship franchises. But then the studio behind the games, Lionhead, was shut down, and the under-development Fable Legends was cancelled. Sucks because the Xbox barely has any exclusive clout as is, and well, now that's just one less that we'll be seeing of. And hey, what's going on with Splinter Cell? The original Xbox run of this series gave us consistent banger after banger stealth game, with Chaos Theory genuinely being one of the greatest games in that genre. But since then, Ubisoft seems to just keep dicking around with the property. Look, Conviction and Blacklist on their own merits are pretty darn good games, but I think I speak for a lot of fans of the series when I say that they aren't really the next of kin compared to all this hotness. This is the first entire console generation without a new Splinter Cell game since the series debuted in 2002, and I want to know what's going on. Yeah, I know we had the little Ghost Recon DLC and Sam got sad because Metal Gear's over. Real cute. Now where's Chaos Theory 2? Are we at an appropriate time when we can consider Guitar Hero forgotten? If you're 24-ish years old like I am, then you'll totally remember the raw power of Guitar Hero in your formative years. You'd be having a decent enough time at your 6th grade last day of school party, but then shit leveled up when Michael brought his PS2 and 2 guitar controllers. Look, I know what you're thinking, wow, Guitar Hero forgotten about, but then again, let's think about it. The last Guitar Hero release worth giving a shit about was Warriors of Rock in 2010. After that, the series was bone dry until Guitar Hero Live in 2015, but this was such a radical departure from the original vision, and it really didn't have the same impact at all, so I don't know that it's really worth even talking about. I think it's cool, the 6-button controller was pretty neat, and GHTV was this really cool setup where you'd play this rotating list of songs over music videos, but that's been discontinued, so oh well, Guitar Hero Live. I was about ages 10 through 15 during the heyday of Guitar Hero, 2005 through 2010, and today's kids that age were born during those years. I mean, I'm not saying kids from this era never touched a Guitar Hero game in their lives, but they certainly weren't around to see the series in its peak or how it's remembered. And to them, maybe Guitar Hero is just another bygone fad, no different than the Rubik's Cube, or probably Speed Stack in this case. So those were just a few of what I consider to be has-been video game icons, names that fell off, whatever you'd like to call them. You could look at a lot of these games or characters and dub them the losers of gaming history, but I feel like that's creating a scale that measures success based in becoming as beloved and everlasting as, Mario. Even if they are forgotten, I think that most of these games do deserve some kind of respect. Regardless of success or not, you can tell that a lot of these games trying to take the stage had a lot of passion behind them, and I think that deserves to be recognized. And yeah, some of these games were just obvious attempts to create something you could easily market, but games like Jet Set Radio or Oddworld, it's important to remember why these games held relevance in the first place. They're weird, they're goofy, they're innovative. All these games really did something to stick out on their own, and even if they relied on established formulas like Gex, at least they took the game into their own original direction. I guess what I'm trying to say with this video is, what the hell happened to F-Zero?